Got it, Peretz. Thank you. Sorry, I posted the wrong number on my link, so I wanted to wait a couple minutes for reposting it to see that people give people time to get on. I guess I'll wait another minute. Okay, I guess we'll start. I apologize for the delay. Okay, again, we're doing this Lili Nishmas. We're learning Lili Nishmas. Ben Yeshua Yosef Moshe, and then Ari Leib Zechar Racha Ben Yeshua Adam Zalman Shal Zaman Aliyah. I wanted to avoid discussing this because we had this share. I mean, it's always good to chaza. I didn't want to get so involved with the how to heat up food on Shabbos day usually. But it seems, based on the amount of texts that I've been getting lately on the subject, it just seems like there's a lot of confusion out there of what the best way to warm up food on Shabbos morning is, how to take like cholent Friday nights and the long winter nights. People want to take cholent, so we'll try and discuss the more common questions that come up. So, and if I leave anything out, again, please somebody post it on the chat what I should discuss, or if I'm not describing it properly, and then we'll go from there. So I don't remember, last week we discussed making coffees and that type of thing. Did we discuss tradition soups? I don't know if we did. We didn't. The tradition soups, the making noodle soups. I don't know if we discussed it or not. So I guess I'll just discuss it for a couple minutes because it gets asked a lot. It has a bad reputation making these soups. People would just automatically assume that to make these type of noodle soups is also on Shabbos. The majority of Muslims say that it's absolutely not a problem to make these tradition soups. He said we did discuss it. Okay, so somebody's saying we discussed it. I'll just do it again just to be safe. The reason why tradition soups are not a problem is because they're pre-cooked. The noodles are pre-cooked. And we know the rule is that once something's cooked, it's ein bishul achar bishul. There's no cooking after cooking. And therefore, you could just recook them and it's no problem. So theoretically, you could even do it into kli rishon. But I tell people, like everything else, just use a kli shlishi just to be safe, that maybe it wasn't cooked or the form of cooking wasn't exactly the way they said it, so the way they say they did it, etc., etc. So it doesn't hurt to use kli shlishi. Just use it with a kli shlishi. The only thing is the spices, which is something, I don't know if we discussed spicing soup. A lot of spices are not pre-cooked. So if you're going to put spices into a soup, you should make sure not to put it into a kli rishon. Make sure to put it into at least a kli shlishi. The only thing is spices maybe cook very easily, so it's like a tea. So if you want to put in the spices, the spice packs that they come with, so then I think tradition soups don't actually come with that one. The other brands do. So what you do is you just let it cool down a little bit, and the dehydrated vegetables, the same thing. If they're only dehydrated, then that's not considered cooked. So, but I don't think those are easily cooked. Either way, if you plan on putting those into the soup, then wait for the soup to be in a kli shlishi. And like we said last week, to be safe, let it cool down for a minute or two, or pour it back and forth from one cup to another cup so it cools down a little, and then add those spices. But Other than that, you're allowed to make a tradition soup, and it's not a problem. Okay, fine. So now the taking cholent. Let's discuss taking cholent. I mean, usually it's cholent, but really it applies to any type of food. Also, okay, so somebody just said, is it a problem to spice cholent on your plate? So if it's a liquidy cholent and it's already in a kli shlishi, then it's not a problem to spice it. By the time you get it, it's probably a little bit cooled down. And if it's liquidy, it's no problem. If to put spices directly on a potato, though, that might be a problem because there is a concept called that a davar gush, something that's a solid, retains its heat, even if it's on a kli sheni or a kli shlishi. So since it retains its heat and it has the halachic status of a kli rishon, so if you have a potato or a piece of meat, something solid that's not in liquid, if it's sitting in liquid, then it doesn't have that din. But if it's something sitting on something solid, then you should not spice it. But it doesn't usually come up because usually the potato is mixed in with more liquid, so then it's not a problem. Okay, fine. So now taking cholent Friday night or Shabbos morning and wanting to keep it on to keep it hot, right? So basically, me'ikar adin, when the cholent is fully cooked, according to the basic halacha, is you're allowed to open up the pot cover, put in the ladle, take out the cholent, and put the pot cover down, and you're fine. According to the basic halacha, that's perfectly mutter. However, there are those that say that when you take out the cholent, perhaps you're mixing things, and perhaps there's some beans that's not fully cooked there, and then when you move them, they get to a hotter place, and we're concerned that you might make them cook a little bit more. It sounds like a very, very far-fetched chashash, very far-fetched concern, but bottom line is that most poskim are concerned with this, and including the Mishnah Brura. So that's why many people are noyek to take the pot off the fire or off the crock pot, and then you could take out the cholent, and then you put it back on to the crock pot. Okay, that's the way most of Klal Yisrael does it. However, what people don't realize is that most people do realize this, but some people don't, which is in order to put that pot back into the crock pot, you need a blech, right? You need a blech in order to be able to put that pot back down into the crock pot, right? Otherwise, you're putting it back on fire. Meaning the same way you don't take food out of the refrigerator and put it down onto a stovetop that has fire unless there's a blech, and even if there is a blech, you can't take it out of the refrigerator. We'll get back to that. Meaning the same way you get fire is the way a crock pot is. Even though you can't see the fire, you can't see the heating element. That's not called a blech. Since that's the regular way to cook, you need to put an additional cover on top of the crock pot that's not normally there. So what most people do is they will line the crock pot with foil, and then that foil will create a blech, and then you could take the cholent pot out, take the cholent, serve it, and then you put it back on, and then it's okay. But you need to have a blech, which most persons say for this tin foil will suffice. My father was not so happy with tin foil, and many poskim say you should use parchment paper instead of tin foil. Okay, but either way, either use tin foil or use parchment paper, and that acts as your blech. Some poskim also say to cover the knob of the crock pot, and then that also not just, it doesn't work just to cover the knob. You need to cover the knob. Well, I'm not going to say that you don't need to cover the knob. You need to line the crock pot. That you need to do. If you want to be machmer and also put on the cover, put a piece of tape across the cover, or turn the crock pot around so that the control is facing the wall where you don't see it, that's a chumrah. But you certainly have to line the crock pot. in order to be able to put the cholent back on. Okay, so that's the din with taking cholent. Okay, now the rules of Chazara are such that in order to put, like we just said, to put the pot back on, there are 5 rules that you have to meet, 5 requirements in order to put the crock pot back onto the fire, put the crock pot back onto the crock pot base, or to take a pot and put it back down on top of the blech. It needs to be 5 requirements. And sometimes we get mixed up with them. But the 5 requirements, not necessarily in any particular order, is the first thing is that the food has to be fully cooked. Okay, that's requirement number 1, is fully cooked. Requirement number 2 is that the food still has to be warm. Right, meaning if you took the crock pot off and you let it sit and it got cold, that cannot be put back onto the flame. So again, requirement number 1 is the food has to be fully cooked. Requirement number 2 is that it needs to be still warm. Requirement number 3, it needs to be in your hand. You cannot take it out of your hand. Once you put the crock pot down, the game is over, and you cannot put it back onto the cholent pot. Requirement number 4 is you have to have it in your mind that you are going to put it back. And requirement number 5 is what we just said, that it has to be covered. The fire or the heating element has to be covered. If you don't meet those 5 requirements, you cannot lichatchila put it back on. If you did, there are scenarios that you could be makel, right? And there are scenarios you can be makel, but not so simple. So let's go through all 5 and exactly what it is. So the first thing is that it has to be fully cooked. Why? Because if it's not fully cooked and you took the crock pot off the base, so then by you putting it on, it's going to cook further, which you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. You're not allowed to cook on Shabbos. So that's why you are not allowed to put it back on the fire if it's not fully cooked. So you have to be careful, because if you take cholent Friday night and then you see that the beans don't seem to be cooked, then you cannot put that cholent back on to the fire. So if you're going to plan to take cholent Friday night, you have to be very sure that it's fully cooked. Okay, that's requirement number 1. Requirement number 2 is that it still has to be warm. That one doesn't usually come up because if you have to hold it in your hand, then you'd have to hold it in your hand for hours and hours for it to cool off. Right, but that's one of the reasons why you can't take the food out of the refrigerator and put it into a crock pot or put it on a blech. Everything we're saying now applies to crock pot, blechs, adjustable hot plates, which we'll get back to in it's probably more than a few minutes. But that's why you can't take things out of a refrigerator, because it's cold. You cannot put that on top of the blech or the crock pot. Okay, so that's requirement number 2. Requirement number 3 is that it has to still be in your hand, right? There are poskim that say that it doesn't necessarily have to be in your hand, because then if you're alone, how do you take cholent? So those poskim say what you can do is that you could sort of lean it on something where your hand is still necessary to hold it, right? But it shouldn't be like putting it down on the counter and then keeping your hand on it. That's not so great. It would work with the evet, but better is sort of you lean it on something so that you're still sort of balancing it or holding it, and then you can take the cholent and put it back. So again, lechatchila is to hold it, not as lechatchila, but also perfectly mutter is to sort of balance it with one hand. Once you take your hand off, lechatchila, you should not put the cholent back. B'diavad, you could put the cholent back. Okay. The 4th requirement is that it needs to be, I'm going a little quick because I'm assuming most are aware of this. The 4th requirement is that you have to have it in your mind that you're putting it back. Meaning, that's going to happen Shabbos morning where you take cholent for the Suda. Somebody says, a guest is coming, an unannounced guest is coming, and they're going to come in an hour, and you go, oh no, how am I going to get the cholent? How am I going to have to do them hot cholent? Let me put it back on. Meaning it was still in your hand when you heard this, or you had your hand on and you wanted to put it back on. So then you wouldn't be able to, because you didn't have it in mind. Okay, and the 5th is what we discussed, is that it needs to be, your heating element needs to be covered. Now, why do we have all this? We just said, at least in the beginning, is that ein bishul achar bishul. Once something is cooked, it cannot be cooked again. So why do we have all these restrictions?
Yes.
Right? So there's basically two reasons why we have these restrictions. One is called Shema Yechata. That's the way it is in Lashon Kodesh. Perhaps you're going to mix the coals. If we're going to allow you to put things down on top of heating elements, on top of fires, so we're afraid that when you go to put it back, you say, hey, this cholent is not so hot. Let me mix the fire. I mean, in the old days, in the Gemara's times, let me mix the coals to try and get the fire to be hotter. Right? Or let me, nowadays would be let me take the switch and make it higher, right? Or something like that. So they were afraid for that. So therefore, they didn't want you to do these things, right? That's one. Two is mechsi kimavashal. This is more important one. Mechsi kimavashal means it looks like you're cooking, meaning somebody walks into your house and sees you taking a crock pot or any pot and putting it down on top of the stovetop or putting it into your crock pot. They say, hey, this person's cooking on Shabbos, right? They're not aware. They weren't there in the kitchen and they don't know that it was already cooked and you have a blech, etc., right? So they think like you're cooking. So therefore, they need to make something that's recognizable, like a blech, and that you can only have it in your hand and you didn't take it off and it wasn't in the refrigerator because it wasn't cold, etc., etc. So because of that putting all these things into your mind so that nobody's going to believe, yourself included, that you're cooking on Shabbos. Right? So let's just repeat. There's two reasons that the Rabban, these are all the Rabbanans. This is not from the Torah. And there are many leniencies. So if you see somebody that's makel on these things, then you don't have to go screaming that Mechal Shabbos. These are all the Rabbanans, even though Chilul Shabbos is for the Rabbanan too. There are loopholes. We're not going to go through all of them, but there are a lot of times that we could be makel, and a lot of this is lechatchil. So again, one is we're afraid that you're going to mix the coals, which basically doesn't apply nowadays because nobody cooks with coals. But adjustable things that are adjustable can be a problem, which we'll get back to. And the other one is that it looks like it's cooking. So since it looks like it's cooking, then you need to have all these restrictions. So now, just an example. Can you take, for those that have radiators in their houses, and the radiator in the winter is hot, and you want to put something on top of a radiator, let's say you take something out of the refrigerator, you want to put it on the radiator in order to warm it up. Most places say that's perfectly fine to do. You don't need a blech. It can go straight from the refrigerator. Why? Because nobody is going to come into your house and think, oh, look, they're taking a pot out of the refrigerator and they're cooking on the radiator. Nobody's going to think that because nobody cooks on radiators, at least maybe yeshiva guys do, but normal people do not cook on radiators, so that would not be a problem. Okay, so that would be like an extreme example where it's not an issue, right? So that's where these takanas are coming from, of having the blech, etc., right? Oh, so now, where does a hot plate fall into this? Meaning, can you use a hot plate or not? Right? The big issue behind the hot plate is a hot plate a radiator, or the equivalent, and therefore you could just take food out of the refrigerator and put it onto the hot plate? Or do we say a hot plate? It could cook, and since it could cook, so then it's no different than a crock pot, in which case you cannot take food out of the refrigerator and put it onto the hot plate. Right? I hope this is okay. I'm explaining the background here because you have some people use hot plates, other people don't use hot plate. The hot plate is a plata. Yes, a hot plate is a plata, right? Basically, what a hot plate is, and this is the first thing that we have to clarify, because I get this lady, I'm getting this shaila a lot. A hot plate, in order to have this shaila of a hot plate, it has to be non-adjustable, right? Has to be totally non-adjustable. If it's an adjustable hot plate, then we have the concern that you might adjust it on Shabbos, even if you don't normally cook on these plata or hot plates. But if it's adjustable, so we have to be concerned. So you cannot, let's make it very clear. According to the majority of poskim, you cannot take a hot plate that's adjustable and take food out of the refrigerator and put it on there, because it needs to have a blech and it needs to meet the 5 requirements. Okay? So again, the basic rule is that anything that you can adjust and or cook on, that will cook food on it, needs to meet the 5 requirements in order to put food on it. If it is non-adjustable, then we have a shaila. Is a non-adjustable like a radiator, in which case you could put food on there straight from the refrigerator without any restrictions, because nobody's going to be concerned that it looks like you're cooking, because nobody would cook on it. And there's no concern that you're mixing the coals, because it's non-adjustable. So that's the question. Do we look at it like that, or do we say no? At the end of the day, this hot plate can theoretically be used to cook, right? So that's where the big machlokes is about hot plates. So l'chatchila, a hot plate that should, the type of hot plate that should be used are the ones that cannot get that hot. Okay, meaning if they can get hot enough to cook, that's more problematic. They're not supposed to, right? They're not supposed to be that hot. They should be less than the amount of time it would take to cook. Now, what does it have to cook? So I once gave a shir years ago, and on Shabbos, and Hilchos Shabbos to men, and they brought a hot plate, and they brought a pot of water, and they put it on the hot plate, and the shir lasted about an hour, and that water was starting to bubble. I don't remember the brand. I don't know. It was a long time ago. So I don't think there would be any point in saying the brand, but because you never know how they work and how they recreate them and redo them. But this water started, on the bottom of the pot, where you start seeing those small bubbles before it really starts bubbling. It got to that point, which would tell me that you left it on there for another hour. It probably, I don't know if it would boil, but it would certainly get hot enough where it could be a problem. It sounds like it would be able to cook an egg, which could be a problem. So that's the first thing, that the hot plates, if you have an extremely, extremely hot plate, then it's probably best not to use it, because even the lenient opinions, if it could cook, might have an issue with it. Okay, but let's assume that the hot plate cannot cook. So then you have a disagreement. Ramosha Feinstein held that it is mutter to use a hot plate and take the food straight out of the refrigerator and put it onto the hot plate Shabbos morning. Those that rely on that opinion have it very easy on Shabbos morning, because the food I don't know if it'll get hot, but it gets decently hot, and it's all good. However, the Israeli poskim of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and others did not like the hot plates. Even if it's non-adjustable, they did not like putting food straight from the refrigerator straight onto the hot plate. They did not like that. I personally, for myself, go with those opinions. Would I eat in somebody's house that used the hot plate? 100% I would. Again, as long as it's not non-adjustable. So it seems like the minhag in America is to use these hot plates. The minhag in Eretz Yisrael, I think, is not to use. Well, I don't know if everybody in the minhag in Eretz Yisrael, but that's the way I understand it. But that's where the machlokes comes from, by using the hot plate. Now, what about warming up? We'll get back to the hot plate, because this can be an important leniency for people to know. Can you put food on top of a crock pot to warm up on Shabbos morning, straight out of the refrigerator? Or if you have a pot on top of it, like a soup pot that you left up at home, can you put food on top of that? So that I'm going to get back to the questions in a few minutes. I just want to get through this. Can you take food and put it down on top of the crock pot or on top of another pot? That is 100% mutter, because nobody's going to look and see chicken or anything out of the fridge, and you're putting it down on top of your crock pot. That I'm assuming that the pot of the crock pot's still in there. Nobody's going to think that you're cooking that way. So that's not a concern, and you could do that. You can do that 100%. Right? The question is, what about an empty pot? Meaning, can I Shabbos morning have my hot plate plata plugged in, and then take an empty pot put it down on top of the hot plate, and then take food and put it down on top of that. So that the poskim say you could do, right? That the poskim say you could do. That's not an issue because there are many that hold that a hot plate is okay even to use it alone. So to take an empty pan or a pot and put it down on top of that and use it, that would be okay. There are those that disagree, but on a hot plate, it certainly works. And even on a blech, many poskim say would work. So basically for those that according this I personally would do, we don't do it in my house, we would go with this and take a hot plate, a non-adjustable hot plate, put down a 9x13 or a cookie sheet upside down, put the food on top of that. No problem. That would be no problem at all. Okay. So that important leniency to know with the hot plates. Again, we would not let you do this on top of a fire, right? On top of a fire, you cannot just take a pan and put it upside down and then put food on top of it because that's your standard blech. That would not work. But as working it in combination of a hot plate together with an upside down pan, you would be able to put it down on top of the hot plate. Okay. Yeah. So that's the basic din of the hot plates. Okay, so now we'll try and answer some of the questions here that we have about that. Blech will get. I think most people don't move around with the blechs, but I'll try and get back to that soon. Okay, so putting silver foil balls on the bottom of the crock pot, really, the whole crock pot needs to be lined. The putting the balls on the bottom is for a different issue, which maybe we'll get to, but really the whole crock pot should be lined, not just the balls. If you add the balls, it's okay, but it's really better if you want to do the utmost, is to have the balls together with the lining. That's the best way to do it. Can you cover a knob on an adjustable to render it non-adjustable? No, you cannot, because that is not a way of using a blech. A blech needs to cover the entire heating element, right? Just covering the knob, even though theoretically it should take care of it, right? Because we're saying the whole concern is that it's the equivalent of moving a knob is the equivalent of mixing ashes, right? So covering the knob should be okay, but the Takanas Chazal was to cover the entire fire, which that's what the hot plate is, and that's what the crock pot is. So you need to cover the entire fire. There is one opinion that in some situations covering the knob would be enough. I don't want to get into that now because it's going to take up too much time. But maybe in a different show we could do that. But again, you need to, because to be Mekayim the takana of Chazal, you need to have the entire heating element covered. And if it's adjustable, then it's considered like a standard fire, and therefore you could use it, but you'd have to meet the five requirements of putting food back onto the oven. Meaning you'd have to onto either the oven or the stovetop or the hot plate. You need to meet the 5 requirements if it's adjustable. So again, you can use an adjustable hot plate, but you need to use it just like a regular standard blech on top of a stovetop. I hope I'm being clear with that. Okay. Now, so somebody's asking here that we're not worried that it's going to get too hot on top of a crock pot. The experience I have with putting food on top of a crock pot is it will not get hot enough. Theoretically, what's behind that question is theoretically, even on top of a pot, if it would get hot enough to cook food, even if it took 24 hours for the food to get hot enough to be cooked raw, then you would not be able to put it down on top of a crock pot. Meaning, if putting something on top of a crock pot, let's say you put grilled chicken on top of a crock pot to warm it up. If theoretically you put raw chicken there, well, let's do a more simple example. I'm sorry. Let's say theoretically that chicken that you're putting on top of that crock pot would get to a temperature of 110 degrees, then you would not be able to put it down on top of a crock pot. That's even if it'll take 20 hours for that grilled chicken to get over 110 degrees, you still would not be allowed to put it on there even for 5 minutes. Meaning you can't say, okay, so if I leave it on for 20 hours, it'll get to 110 degrees. So I'll just leave it on for 2 hours and it'll only get to 100 degrees. And then it'll be, you can't do that. If there's any way that it would get to 110 degrees, you're not allowed to put it on there. From my experience, nothing on top of, nothing, usually you put it in foil. You're not putting the food directly on top of the crock pot. So the food does not get close to being hot. Again, I never left it on for 20 hours. To be honest, I never left it on for 20 hours. I'm just assuming that it can't. But theoretically, if you kept the crock pot on 500 and you knew that it would get the food on top of the crock pot to 110 degrees, then yeah, then you'd be right. And I appreciate you bringing it up. Wouldn't be able to keep it there. I'm just assuming that that's not going to happen. Another thing, just to be careful, if you take a challah and put the challah down straight on top of the glass with not in a foil, could very well make the challah fleishiks. Could make the challah fleishiks, which you're not supposed to have fleishik challah, and then certainly you can't use the leftover for making French toast on Sunday. So you just have to be aware of that. So I tell you to use a foil. Why a foil makes it not fleishiks is a different topic for a different time. If we'd ever do kashrus, then maybe we can discuss that. But so that's that. Okay, so then that's the din of the hot plate. Okay, now another common question that somebody posted here is what's with putting the hot plate on a timer? Okay, unfortunately, this happened many years ago after there was the family in Brooklyn that lost, I think, 7 children or 7 people when there was a fire because of their hot plate. Their neshama should all have an aliyah. So people didn't want to leave their hot plates on a whole Shabbos. So that's a little bit of a problem because the poskim say that even though we use Shabbos clocks for everything, we use Shabbos clocks for lights, we use Shabbos clocks for air conditioners, etc., but because of the severity of cooking on Shabbos, the poskim are very much against putting hot plates and crock pots on a timer. Okay, so basically, what the poskim do say is okay, is keeping, if you want to put it on a timer, if you leave the food on there from before Shabbos, then you could put it on a timer, right? Which I think most people are not going to do because I think the food will turn bad, right? Or, for example, let's say you're afraid to leave the cholent on a whole night unattended. So let's say you set the clock to shut it off at 1 a.m. and then it goes off for 2-3 hours, which I think will still stay warm for those 2-3 hours. And then you have it turn on again, let's say 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, then that would be okay. Because since you put the food on there from before Shabbos, it doesn't look like you're cooking. Meaning the poskim were not happy with 2 things: putting a clock on a timer, and then also putting food on top of that hot plate. Putting a clock on top of a hot plate or putting it down onto a crock, not on top. Taking a timer on a crock pot or a hot plate, and also taking food out of the refrigerator and putting it on there on top of it, that the poskim do not like because it's just too similar to turning on a fire on Shabbos. So, but if you put the food on there from before Shabbos, then you're okay. So that's the concern. Now, what some poskim say you can do is if you have, like we said before, an upside down pan on top of the hot plate from before Shabbos, then you'd be able to turn it on the clock and then put food on there. So that you can do, but to put it straight on a hot plate, that the poskim don't like. If you put it on a timer. To shut it off, that's not an issue, because again, shutting off, that doesn't look like cooking. Since it doesn't look like cooking, so then it's no problem. So if you know that you want a hot plate on for Friday night and you're eating out Shabbos day, or or your meal is going to be over by 12 o'clock on Shabbos morning, and you want to keep it shut off because you don't want people to burn themselves. You don't want a sakana. So then to shut off is no issue. It's only turning it on in order to put food on there where you'll have a problem. Okay, so that's putting the hot plate on a timer. Okay, warming jaws. Warming jaws is a lot of confusion of whether you're allowed to use a warming jaw or not. For those that are not familiar, some ovens have warming jaws under them. They have a separate compartment. Some people have warming jaws built into the cabinets. So there's a big issue with the warming jaws. First of all, the first thing you have to know before you use the warming jaw is it adjustable or not, like we've been discussing. If it's adjustable, then it's no different than an oven, and therefore you can't use it unless you make a blech and you use the 5 requirements for using a blech, which from what I understand, most warming jaws are adjustable. So then you'd have a problem. But yes, theoretically, you could line your warming jaw with foil and cover the knobs, and then you would be able to use the regular dinim of chazara for that. If you don't have but there are poskim, so that's why you may go to somebody's house where they use a warming jaw, and the poskim say, well, if you tape up the adjustable part very well, and you make some sort of siman, like you have some foil sticking out of the warming jaw that sort of acts like a blech, and then they would let you take food out of the refrigerator and put it into the warming jaw. But there are opinions that say that. From what I understand, that's not the mainstream opinion. But there are opinions that say that. So it's if somebody wants to rely on that, or somebody does rely on that, you don't have to not eat by them. You certainly don't have to make any machaz on them, etc., etc. But most would say that you can't do that. If it's non-adjustable, which I don't think many are, then it's no different than the hot plate or the plata. So if it's non-adjustable and it can't cook, right? If it's non-adjustable and it can get up to 400 degrees, that's obviously way too hot, and then you can't put food there. But if it's non-adjustable and it gets up to, let's say, 150 degrees or 200 degrees, then whatever rules you do by the hot plate would be the same rules. That would be the same rules for this, and then you'd be able to use it. The only thing is, you have to be careful, because some of them, from what I understand, some of these warming jaws have a fan or some sort of mechanism that the minute or the second you open that door, it shuts off. Then if that's your type of warming jaw, then obviously you can't use that warming jaw on Shabbos. So I don't know. I mean, the Star K is very good with all these things. So they may know based on the model that you have, whether it does or it doesn't, or you'd have to do some sort of experimentation to see if it works. But for the most part, either way, I don't think most warming jaws are adjustable. So then it's not going to really help. Now, another thing that comes up, because since the hot plates are not so hot, and putting food on top of the crock pot is not so hot, so what people want to do is they want to drape a towel over the food that's on top of the crock pot or on top of the hot plate, and then that maybe will get it to be hotter. So that is a isser called hatmana, which is insulating. You are not allowed to insulate food on Shabbos, or even before Shabbos, if it's going to add heat to the food, right? That's something that's also, and the reason why they made it also is similar to what we said before, is because if we're going to allow you to insulate, then you may end up messing with the coals, etc., etc. So they made a gezerah that you are not allowed to insulate on Shabbos at all, and from even before Shabbos, you're not allowed to insulate if it's going to add heat. Meaning to insulate on Shabbos, that you can't do at all. But let's say some people, I think in Eretz Yisrael, some people do this. They don't want to leave, especially in the summer. It's very hot. So what they do is they'll take the soup and they'll wrap it in towels and blankets from before Shabbos. That's allowed from before Shabbos. because it's not adding heat. It's just going to maintain heat. So to do insulating to do an insulation on food before Shabbos that will not add heat, which is like putting it in a blanket, putting it in towels, that's no problem. On Shabbos, you cannot do that. But there is a way to do it on Shabbos if it's necessary. I don't think it's too common. Is if you take it out of the pan that it was cooked in, or out of the pot that it was cooked in, and put it into a kli sheni, then you would be able to insulate it, because there's no concern about messing ashes, because you already put it into a second kli that you didn't cook with. Okay, I don't know how common that is, but on even before Shabbos, you are not allowed to drape food on top of your crock pot or hot plate, etc., because combining the towel obviously is not adding heat, but the towel on top of the food with the heat coming out of the heating element will create more heat, and that's not allowed even if you do it before Shabbos. Okay, so most people are not doing that before Shabbos, but what they want to do it on Shabbos is on the, drape a towel or something over the crock pot, right? Or people that like very hot coffee or tea. So what they'll do is they'll take a paper bag and put it on top of the urn so that it gets much hotter. Okay, that is a problem from before Shabbos, because you're actually adding heat. So then that's an issue. So the basic way out of this is that you have to, in order for it to be considered insulating, it has to go over the entire top and down the sides of the food. And it has to be directly against the pot. Meaning if there's a space of a couple of inches in between the pot and what's insulating it. So let's say you take a paper bag and you have some space in between the paper bag and the wall of the urn, then that would be okay. That's not considered hatmana, because that space there acts as sort of I don't know, it's not a barrier, but it's not going to create that much heat. So if you wanted to just put a towel across the top of your pots on top of the crock pot or whatever it is, or on top of the food on the top, then that's fine, as long as it doesn't go down the sides. If it goes down the sides, so as long as it doesn't go fully down the sides, then you're also okay, right? So again, so if you want to drape a towel around your food that's on top of the crock pot, so as long as it just goes on the top and doesn't go down the sides, then it's okay. And even if it goes down the sides, if it's not directly up against the pot, then it's also okay. And that's a way to insulate your food a little bit on Shabbos, to sort of try and get it a little bit hotter. For those that don't use any of these chumras, which there are many, then there's no real way to get hot food on Shabbos morning other than having your cholent and try and warm up things that's basically on top of the cholent, or any other food that you have. Okay, is there anything else? And I think that's basically it. Okay, one other small thing that I don't know if it comes up so often, but if you realize that your cholent needs hot water, it's burning, so can you add hot water to your cholent on Shabbos? So there's really three ways of adding hot water to the cholent. First of all, your cholent needs to be on a blech, because if you're adding water to cholent and it doesn't have a blech, so then that's putting hot water on top of back onto a fire, which is not allowed unless you have a blech, right? So obviously you have to talk about when you're taking water from an urn. You can't take cold water and add it to the cholent, that's cooking. You're taking hot water from an urn and you want to add it to the cholent. So the best way to do it would be to take the cholent off the fire or the crock pot, put it under the urn, and then take the hot water and go directly from the urn into the cholent, right? But no mixing the water in. Just put in the water slowly, cover it back up, and put it back on. Now, if you're going to do this for hilchos kashrus purposes, don't let the crock pot stay that close to the urn, because then the steam will go up and make your urn flacious, which is really not that big a deal, but it's better not to do that. So again, option number one and the best option would be to take the crock pot off the fire, put it under the urn, let the water come out of the urn, and go straight into the crock pot. That's one. The second best would be take a ladle, take off the top of the urn, take off the cover of the urn, put a ladle in there, let the ladle sit in there for a few seconds till it gets hot, and then take the ladle and go directly to the charlant and put it in. That would be option number two. I think that one's a little bit more difficult. So again, you take off the pot of the urn, stick in a ladle, leave it in there for like 10, 15 seconds till it gets hot, so that makes into a klirishin, then take it and pour it into the charlant. That's option number two. Option number three is this is the easiest option, but it's not the best option, but it is mutter, according to many, is just take a cup, put the water from the urn into the cup, and then take the cup and then pour the hot water into the urn. That's the easiest way, and you can rely on that. You can rely on that if it's necessary. So again, just to review, the three ways is to take off the crock pot from the fire, put it directly under the urn, let the hot water go into it. Option number two is to open up the cover of the urn, put in a ladle, leave it in there, and then put it into the charlant. And the third is to take straight from the urn into a cup and then put that cup into the charlant. Okay, so that's, I guess we'll end with that. Just to review what we discussed tonight, there's basically 5 requirements in order to take food and put it back on the fire. 1 is the food has to be fully cooked. 2 is that you have to keep the food in your hand, or at least balancing it with your hand. It has to be, you have to have it in your head that you're putting it back. And it has to be, the fire has to be covered, and it still has to be warm. Those are basically your 5 requirements. You cannot take food out of the refrigerator and put it onto a blech or anything like that, because it's going to be cold and it wasn't still in your hand, right? Then we discussed hot plates. So there's a disagreement whether a hot plate is considered like a radiator, which nobody's going to confuse you with cooking. So therefore they would say you can take out of the refrigerator and put it onto a hot plate, but again, it has to be a non-adjustable hot plate. If it's adjustable, then it has the same halachas of using a regular blech. We said that you should not use a timer to put on the crock pot or the hot plate on Shabbos and then add food. But if you leave the food on there from before Erev Shabbos and then you want it to turn on, that would be mutter. And then we had a few ways that you can add hot water to a cholent that's burning. Okay, I hope that was clear. I hope that wasn't too boring. Next week, because it's the off Shabbos for most yeshivas, so we're not going to be having a shir. As Hashem continue the week after that till they change the clocks, and then we'll get more into other things that come up with Shabbos, like setting the table, removing garbage, combing wigs, washing floors, cleaning up spills, those type of things, receiving packages on Shabbos, reading menus, reading books, reading cookbooks, etc., those, cutting letters, opening packages. I know it's a tall order, it sounds like a lot. Hopefully we'll have at least a few weeks worth to discuss. Okay, everybody should have themselves a good tvach and a good yar, and B'suras Tavos.